These days, arts and crafts have gained a rather nasty and not necessarily accurate reputation for being extremely expensive to partake in. And while it's true that some specialized crafts can require constantly restocking expensive materials like oil paints or silicone and keeping around specialized tools, there's so much that you can do with just a basic set of tools. When trying to approach apartment-friendly crafting, it can be a little overwhelming when thinking about what sorts of tools are useful to keep around. So today, we'll go over a quick list of useful tools that should let you approach most crafts without having to go out and find something new. By no means will this be an exhaustive list, as everybody has different crafts that they like to partake in, but it should be a good jumping off point. For starters, blades. In most crafts, you'll come across the need to slice something up every once in a while, but if you're not shooting for something like metal or wood, you can generally get by with a snap blade, which, as the name suggests, is a blade that you can snap off portions of when the top one starts to get too dull. However, this is not the thing that I love best about it. I actually love the fact that it retracts and extends, allowing you to have the blade of the length that you need for your material. So, if I'm just cutting cardboard, I can make it pretty shallow, but if I'm trying to get through upholstery foam, I have around 4 inches of blade that can work, and because the blade can be easily changed out, it allows me to always have a sharp edge. For finer details, I tend to gravitate towards an X-Acto blade, also known as a hobby knife. This is wonderful because just like with the retractable snap blade, you can change out the blade itself. However, if you're doing this, then you need to have something known as a sharps container. This is a container that you can insert your used, dull blades and needles and other pointy bits into so that you don't accidentally stab yourself or the garbage man when you're throwing them out. Now, with both of these blades, and in general sharp things, you want to be careful to always retract the blade or generally sheath it when it's not in use, even if you're just walking away for a second. Your future self will thank you for this. You only have so many fingers. So, be it with a block of foam or retracting it back into itself, be careful not to leave exposed blades lying around when you can help it. And of course, anytime that you need to cut something on the table, you're going to want something like a cutting mat. It is also referred to as a self-healing mat. You want to take care to not cover it in paint and hot glue, as this mat works best if it is smooth and flat. Don't be like me, your future self will be very sad. Keep your cutting mat nice and clean. Now, if you find you want to be cutting more woodsy things, you can either go with a nice controlled miter box and miter saw, which is a pole saw that slots into this little box to make sure that your cuts remain nice and perpendicular, or nice and at an angle. Or if you're doing larger projects, you can also get something known as a flush trim saw, or a Japanese pole saw. I suggest having 2 pairs of scissors, one that you designate for mean things like cutting cardboard or other such things that will definitely dull and injure your scissors, and one clean one that's more for cutting things like fabric. And if you do find yourself in need of cutting particularly strong things like sheets of aluminum, you can also get a pair of tin snips. Though they are not necessary, they can be quite helpful. Now, moving away from blades for a little while, you should have 2 pairs of preferably needle-nosed pliers. One that has teeth and one that's nice and smooth. The nice and smooth doesn't leave marks. The teeth, there is a possibility. And if you look at these pliers, you notice this section, which is a blade and can be used for cutting wire, can also be pretty easy to injure this section and dull it, chip it, or some other way destroy it. So I also like to keep on hand either a pair of flush trim cutters or diagonal cutters to cut through things like wire, sticks, and whatever else I need. If I could only have one of these, I would probably pick the diagonal cutters as they are a little stronger and cut through more things, but if you do smaller, more detailed work, the flesh trim cutters can be very nice because, as the name suggests, they are capable of cutting things flush. You should also try to keep around at least one pair of tweezers, if not a couple. And of course, you will find a hammer incredibly helpful. Though if you find yourself smashing a whole lot of things, you may also want to have a rubber mallet, which you can use to give things the smackdown, but won't leave quite as much of a mark on your surface. It really depends on what's right for your projects. And of course, you should try to keep around a flathead screwdriver as well as a Phillips head screwdriver. Of course, the Phillips head is going to be used for screwing things in, and the flathead will probably too. But more than that, it can be very helpful for prying things. If you find yourself doing a lot of detail work, it can also be incredibly helpful to get a nice set of mini screwdrivers in flat and Phillips. Next up, for measuring and marking things, you should have some version of a pencil, as it can be erased. You should also be sure to have some version of a pencil sharpener and eraser. When you need to mark something a little more hardcore, it's also useful to have around a black and silver Sharpie, but be warned, once you mark something with Sharpie, it is incredibly difficult to cover that up as it tends to seep upward through the paint. To go along with these, you're also going to want a straight edge, which flows perfectly into our need to be able to measure things. There are lots of different methods of this. You can of course use some version of a ruler, a fabric tape measure, or a regular tape measure. The fabric tape measure is much more versatile than a ruler, and the normal tape measure is much better at measuring larger items. But it's really about the types of things that you generally do. Next up, paintbrushes. Even if you don't think you'll ever be painting, it's good to have some around for the just-in-case moments. I would suggest 2 detail brushes, one kind of medium brush, and a nice chonky one. To go along with these, you can have some version of reclaimed glass jar for your rinse, or something a little more specialized, though it's incredibly unnecessary. It's also helpful for a palette to keep around something like a plastic to-go container that you can put your paint on, and then when you're done with it or need to step away for a bit, you can then close and hopefully keep your paint around for a little longer. This can be helped with a little bit of water at the bottom of the container. It's also helpful to keep around a paintbrush or small foxtail specifically for cleaning your work table. This can be very helpful for brushing off little bits and bobs that get in your way. But again, you kind of want to keep this just for cleaning. Otherwise, you'll probably burn through them pretty quickly. I also suggest having more than just the 4 paintbrushes, because if you only have 4, you have to be super duper careful to clean each one of them very thoroughly. Personally, I'm just not that careful, so I keep around dozens and dozens for any time I accidentally murder 1 or 2 of them. I'm sorry for what I've done to you, paintbrush, but also, it was bound to happen one day. Now, even if you don't actually intend to ever need to sew, it can be very helpful to keep around a few sewing tools. Specifically, it can be helpful to keep around a pin cushion and a couple of pearl head pins or flat head pins depending on your preference, as well as a few straight sewing needles and possibly a curved one, though that could be my upholstery background showing its bias. I also personally like to keep around a spike or an awl for the surprisingly frequent occurrence of needing to poke a hole in things. Now we move on to the most important category, PPE, also known as personal protective equipment. If you can have nothing else, at least have a pair of safety glasses. Remember, you only have 2 eyeballs. Do try to protect them when necessary. Can also be handy to keep around hearing protection, either in the form of inner ear plugs or over ear muffs, but with apartment-friendly building, you're probably not going to be making that much noise. It's also very helpful to keep around disposable gloves in the appropriate size. just in case you're doing something that you're not super sure if it should be getting on your skin, or you know for a fact it should not be getting on your skin, keep gloves around. Your fingers will thank you. This is also very helpful if you're doing something that dries quickly on your skin and you just don't want to deal with it. A dust mask is also super nice to keep around, which is great because you probably already have tons in your home as you're taking precautions for any sort of airborne illnesses. But these can be super handy in the shop as well, so that you keep yourself from getting dust particles or other such fun in your nose. Like say if you were sanding Bondo, you wouldn't want that in your respiratory system. As far as power tools go, they can be a little less apartment friendly, since apartment friendly generally means noise and mess friendly. However, the one that I do swear by would be a nice drill, which can make things much easier. It doesn't need to be cordless like this, as there are plenty of wonderful corded options. However, along with the drill, you're likely going to want a set of drill bits, because that's what you're going to be using it mostly for. Otherwise, you get stuck with a little hand drill like this, which is super duper handy, but can also take a bit of time and effort. Along with that, you're going to want a Phillips bit or whatever type of screw is most common in your domicile, and you might even want a little bit sleeve, which can make screwing things in much easier, and since it's magnetic, it can make changing bits out much quicker. Similar to the drill, the hot glue gun can also make life much easier. However, my word of caution is to watch out if it is a low heat or a high heat gun, or if it's fancy schmancy like this one and you can swap between the two. I generally leave it on low heat unless I'm doing something that really needs it all the way up there, because the high heat can burn you, burn everything, and just generally be molten lava. If you are stepping away from your work area, you should unplug the hot glue gun. Even if you think you're gonna be coming right back to it, you should unplug it for fire safety reasons and for not accidentally putting your hand on something incredibly hot. If you find that you're hot gluing a lot, it can be useful to get a tile to put underneath the tip of it so that it'll catch your little glue drips. While it's not a power tool, similar to the hot glue gun and the drill, this can be incredibly useful for fastening things together. So not a must-have, but definitely a handy. A little hand stapler. Just be sure to watch out that you get the correct size staples, as the different brands have different size staples. And finally, while not strictly tools, I do find these incredibly helpful. First off, try to make sure that your area that you're working in is as well lit as possible, but specifically you do not want your light source directly behind you, or your own shadow will cast on your work and make it more difficult to see the details and make it more likely that your fingers get a little slicey. On that same note, you're going to want to keep around a basic first aid kit with at least band-aids, first aid ointment, burn cream, and alcohol pads. And you may find that the alcohol pads are very useful in crafting, as they can clean things like Sharpie away, so you're probably going to want to keep more of those around than you would originally think, or your first aid kit will run dry. And finally, some version of little clamps, or things that can hold things together. These can be super useful, and while not necessarily a safety concern, they can just make your life much easier. And that's about it for the basics. If you have any specific questions, please leave them down in the comments, and if this was helpful to you, please do let me know, and I'll follow it up with a follow-up video about specific basic materials that can help augment your crafty projects, which is all the stuff that's over there. Those are the nice materials that I like to keep around, things like epoxy or PVA glue, things that can be used in all manner of situations that allow me to just think of a project and be like, time to get started, and generally not have too difficult a time in trying to find what I need just in my little studio here. Well, see you next time!